Sunday morning.
Yeah, so we are all. Yeah.
I came.
I don't know when to start.
Hello, Kane, can you hear us?
Oh, we can't hear him.
We are not able to hear you.
Oh, there we go. Hello? Oh.
They're not watching on live stream on YouTube.
Kane, we are not able to hear you. Can you just check your speaker or microphone?
Glitchy.
It's coming and going, Kane. Like we don't have a consistent connection. So can you just check your microphone and speakers are on? But seems like it's getting mute. We can hear you, but it's not fluid. Like when we spoke this morning, it was much better. So I'm not sure what has changed.
It's me.
You okay? Yeah.
Hello, Simon. Are you on bridge?
You know me in computer.
The audio is coming, but it's not fluent. Like it seems like there is a lot of background noise on that.
I don't see you.
Can you speak? Can you speak for 10 seconds, Kane?
See, I can't even see you. Oh, there you go.
We can't hear you.
And now you're gone.
Are you sure your laptop is not muted? I can hear. Something wrong with this.
You have to.
Time to go.
I think at the meeting. Yeah. I was. We're not speaking back on.
Once it starts working, everyone's so
Hello, Brian. Are you on bridge?
Yeah, it's Brian here.
Yeah. So, Brian, are you seeing any audio feed from Kane?
I am seeing audio feed. He does seem to have a little bit of packet loss going on. I don't know if he's able to maybe lower his speed. That may correct the issue, but I mean, he's connected at 1024 at the moment. There shouldn't be anything that's blocking his audio, though.
Just spoke with.
Can you hear me? Testing.
We'll be in the middle of the conversation and like, my friend sent it from Spain when you get the test. She usually just tells me sorry.
Kane, we are still not able to hear you.
Yeah, that reconnecting to fix it. It seems to be either something with Kane's network or possibly the microphone itself might be having issues. Do you have another microphone you would be able to try, Kane?
So Kane, are you using your laptop microphone, or is there an external microphone available there? Oh, so we can hear you, but it's very slow. So I'm not sure if you're speaking very far from the microphone or. I'm not sure what's happening here. So, Brand, can we ask him to drop down his call rate to 512 kb?
Yes, so I don't know if perhaps, Kane, you were shown how to reduce your connection speed. You'll have to hang up on the bridge, reconnect, and then in the preview, your video preview screen, you can click on a gear icon there that will allow you to adjust your speed. I can also provide you the phone number, or if I can get your phone number, I can also walk you through our phone if you like. I don't know if I can just let you know our phone number here. It's 1-8.
Yeah, you don't have to. Unless you just have to
1-888-777-7965.
Benjamin, I think you can just start and we'll see what's happening.
Now. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you.
Can you hear me better?
Yeah, much better actually. Here, Sandeep, are you able to hear Kane?
Can you hear me better?
Yes, we can. Are you able to hear us?
Yes.
I mean, you can hear me? Excellent. You can boost your volume here a little bit.
It appears that it's stabilized a bit.
Yeah, you are coming through a lot clearer now. Okay, yeah, I'm just waiting for, I guess, Sandeep to confirm when he returns.
Okay.
Maybe some terms. So one of the things that Peggy and I often get asked, and we're from the Aboriginal Student Centre here at Durham College, so our job here is to support Indigenous students and also provide support to faculty, and we just kind of do everything. So So terminology, we often get asked what is the correct terminology to use when talking about Indigenous or Aboriginal people. And the reality is there's a couple different terms that we've heard historically, and none of them are actually accurate. So first we start off with the term Indian, which in fact is actually the legal term and continues to be the legal term, so we're not escaping that terminology. So that is what is held within the Indian Act. So that term will always remain. However, it is not necessarily the term of preference for most people. Does anybody know where the term Indian comes from?
Christopher Columbus.
Christopher Columbus. So what happened with him?
He thought he was in India.
Yeah. So this guy is looking for India, gets lost, actually never stood foot in Canada or the state. He actually landed in the Caribbean islands and named the people there Indians. And somehow this has overtaken all of North America. So we do not identify ourselves as Indians. However, again, this is the legal terminology. We moved into the term Native, which was acceptable for many years. It's not that it's unacceptable, although it's just not the preferred term. Aboriginal is an umbrella term which recognizes First Nations, both status, non-status, Métis, and Inuit people. So that is an umbrella term used within Canada. And so again, it doesn't talk about who we are as people. And most recently, we have the term Indigenous. After consulting with community members and our neighboring First Nations, the reason, or it's my understanding, the reason why Indigenous is now the preferred term is because the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which Canada was an objector until this June. Once they removed their objector status, Canada now basically states that it does recognize that Indigenous people have rights and to use that terminology more often. However, it still does not speak to who we are as individuals. So I would identify myself as Anishinaabe, whereas Peggy would identify herself as Algonquin.
The best.
Anishinaabe. Is better. And we do have now Kane Chamberlain online with us. I'll do a little bit of an introduction here. Oh, no, I won't, because I lost his bio.
Oh.
My apologies. Oh, Vandina, can you read? Okay. So thank you for joining us, Kane. And I'm going to do a little intro. So Kane Hunter Chamberlain is Bear Clan of Algonquin French descent from the Antoine First Nation. Kane has been working with Indigenous brothers and sisters since 1990 when he opened Ontario's first cross-cultural Phase 2 open custody facility for young males in conflict with the law. Since then, Kane has held various high-profile positions that continued to address cultural and justice needs for Indigenous people across Ontario. Whether his focus was on assisting those involved in the court process, community mediation and conflict resolution, developing Aboriginal policy for youth justice services, or intergovernmental affairs, working with federal inmates returning to their communities, and more recently as a private practice therapist, seeing Indigenous clients through the National Indian Health Branch, and as an emergency on-call therapist for Health Canada. Kane believes the following to hold true. The needs of individuals are few, namely to be seen, heard, believed, to know that they are trusted and held in good faith, to be allowed to take their place, and to know their existence is beneficial. It is at the center of these values that Kane engages his community and society. So thank you for joining us, Kane. So I think we're still having a little technical difficulty.
I think he can hear us.
He can hear us?
Can you hear us, Kane?
Yes, he can.
Okay, great.
Okay, so some of the points that we wanted to touch on today was that Indigenous people are overrepresented in Canada's criminal justice system as both victims and as offenders. And just to give you a little bit of background, when I was doing my undergraduate work in the early 1990s, a fair bit of the focus that I held was on the overrepresentation of Indigenous people within the criminal justice system. I'm not very happy to say that 25 years later, we are the disparity has even grown more. So there are today more Indigenous people within the criminal justice system than there was 25 years ago. And it was problematic 25 years ago. We had the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples talking about the problems within the justice system, and 25 years later we have the Truth and Reconciliation Commission going over the same basic facts.
And the Supreme Court has actually called this, it's a crisis, it's a major crisis in the Canadian justice system, and it's one of the clearest markers. And this is all coming from the highest court of the land. Mm-hmm. So they've obviously been one of the front runners in this discussion as well.
So it's obvious that there are problems within the justice system, and I think it's safe to say that this really does come down to systemic discrimination for Aboriginal peoples within Canada. Is Kane able to talk? Oh, great. No, yes, we can hear you now. So I just wanted to hear your ideas on this from your perspective.
Obviously, I think Ash has probably studied quite a bit, so can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
we can hear you.
It organizations. Is it okay?
You keep breaking up.
Yeah,
Yeah,
you
it
keep
keeps
breaking
cutting
up.
off, yeah. It's the hardware, okay.
Okay, so we'll just continue on with that. So they're overrepresented both as victims and as offenders. So the big question here is, do we believe that Indigenous people are more crime prone?
What do you guys think? They're more crime prone? Prone to crime?
Are they more criminal? No. To commit a crime, yeah. So if we're overrepresented within the justice system, does that mean that we are just basically more criminal?
There's so many different factors.
Okay, so that's great, because this is what this is about, is a discussion. So what do you guys see as the factors that affect the overrepresentation? What are some of the issues?
Experiences from residential schools.
Okay. So experiences from residential schools? Discrimination?
Abuse of substances and
Substance abuse? Okay.
Policies.
I'm sorry?
Oppressive policies.
Oppressive policies. What about the treatment within the justice system itself? Do you realize that a great portion of the people that are within the justice system are there for petty crimes? Things that non-Indigenous or non-people of color would be in jail for. Things like non-payment of fine or jaywalking, that kind of thing. So let's talk about the experience of residential school. Well, let's just talk about the historic experience for people, Indigenous people, when it comes to policing and the law. And we can begin to see that there are two different experiences within Canada. So the mainstream experience, and then we have the Indigenous experience, which are two very different experiences within the same country, which is often difficult for people to understand. But I'll share this story with you. Both of my grandparents went to residential school and survived that experience. But as a child, when I would go to visit my grandparents, my grandmother, and the community where they ended up living, there was a city, there was train tracks, and then there's city on one side, and then there's the reserve on the other. And my grandmother used to tell us, grandchildren, to go play on the train tracks. Now, this is probably not something that most people in this room, grandparent told them. But my grandmother had very good reason for doing this. She said, if you play on the train tracks, and if the city cops come, then you can run onto the reserve and you'll be safe. And if you play on the train tracks and the reserve cops come, then you can run onto the city side and you'll be safe. So this talks about the experience of police within First Nations community and how it really is unsafe. And this can be directly related back to, how children were taken from their communities and homes to go to residential school. In many cases, it was...
Can I stop for a second to help you?
Absolutely.
Okay, sorry guys.
Lon is here to save the day.
Kane, I'm Lon, the director of the Global Classroom, and I'm just going to help you solve a technical problem. What you're seeing right now is what happens when we don't test with the guest in advance. So next time we do this, please respond to our emails, okay? That's all I'm going to say now. The second thing is, we think we can manage this by having you phone in to the class, okay? So please check your email right now. Our technical director is going to send you an email, and he's going to tell you exactly what to do, and then we can hear you, because your thoughts are obviously critical. And the students are sitting here, and I'm sure they're frustrated, as I am. I'm watching the live stream, but we want to connect you. So please, if we could just take a couple of minutes while, check your email, follow that, and basically we have a feature where you can phone into the class. Okay, so I think we can solve that. Okay. Thanks, guys. Good. Okay, so just hang on for a second as it gets connected, okay? Yeah, we were trying to test, but the guests get so busy and they're not, this is what happens. But anyways, we'll get it solved.
Yeah, it's
like what the global class is.
First day after
It's an adventure. The ship leaves port, it gets wrecked, it crashes a little bit, then it keeps going. Eventually, it gets good.
Coming all over my words.
No.
All right.
Thunder Bay Police. You're the ones who told me about Thunder Bay Police.
Okay.
Oh, the Starlight? That's Winnipeg Police.
Oh, Winnipeg.
Yeah, Winnipeg.
Starlight
yeah.
Police, or Starlight Tour.
It's happened in Ontario too.
Cherry Beach
Oh,
Tour
yeah.
with Toronto Police, same thing.
Yeah.
Except obviously not the same.
But I thought it was also, you were telling me about Thunder Bay Police, and they were talking about doing the training, but yet the way police view. Was it you? I think
It could have been. You know what?
Yeah.
You know how much stuff.
I know, there's so much
like
stuff.
that's all there is.
You've got you've got a billion tabs open in your head, right?
Yeah. So it's like, we read all this stuff all the time. And
I know. No, I'm just trying to think of policing examples, right? Where their police service is really racist.
Oh yeah.
Where they don't. Think,
Okay, so then we could even talk about. The pig farmer.
Oh.
Picton, yeah.
Yeah, Robert Picton. And how he failed to take missing persons.
That's the other under police. So it's either
That's what I mean. You need some
You can never win.
direction.
You can never. There's no. With the police, there's. That's what I mean. You never.
Can't find the right balance.
I don't know what the right balance is, though.
But because the Western, that's just utterly flawed. So how can you have balance within a flawed system that does not support community?
Yeah. And even just looking at those instances for the last 20, 30 years. So starting like with Oka, for example, Oka crisis, and then you look at Ipperwash, and then Caledonia.
Yeah.
So, and then you get, Idle No More, and then Caledonia Part 2.
Kane, are you? Can you hear me? It's Lon. Can you check your email? Okay. Do you see the directions from our technical director?
Yeah, to call in, get the number.
Yes, you're gonna get a call, a toll-free number. Just phone it. All you have to do is phone it, but we can keep your face. We can see you. We'll be able to hear you. It's all supposed to work. Okay. So do you have a number there?
Yep.
Just nod. Okay, great. Good. So, okay, here we go. This is the first time we've done this, so it's got to work because it's like the radio part of the global class that you can call into the class.
Right. Okay.
So we're trying all different ways of connecting, but this is supposed to be.
This is not how this works all the time, eh, Lon?
I've got to tell you, in the 5 or 6 years of my doing this, this is what it used to be all the time, and we get through it. Now we test, all the time, but
And tomorrow,
tomorrow we're good. Yeah,
who's the third?
Budapest coming in.
Budapest.
And the director of international relations there is anonymous. And
That's going to be fun. He's done more students last week.
maybe, okay, for you, Kane, is it, do you want to just, it's too much trouble, we'll just forget it, and you can tweet. You can tweet in your questions or comments.
It's not working.
It's not working.
It's not going to feel it.
It has to be.
Thanks for the
Of course, no. Take it. Keep it for later. No, I keep a couple boxes in my office.
I keep
Okay.
snacks too, but I don't know. I must.
Your diet, your blood hyperglycemia. Yeah, my mom is too. So I keep stuff for her.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Because it's like here's a candy.
Yeah, I never know how I'm going to react, and then when my body's starting to metabolize it too, but sometimes I'll sweat or shake.
And
Give
then
me a thumbs up if
also
it's not working. Okay, just put a thumb up if it's not working.
Your daughter or your dog?
My dog. Oh, no, my dog. Get that.
It's not working, right? No? Okay. Let's stop. Okay, let's stop that. Can you tweet? Right now? Can you go to the Twitter?
Go to the Twitter.
Go to the global.
Same, I don't even know.
Okay, at the very, very, very least, here's what we're going to do. We're going to go like really old school, old fashioned. Do you have a sheet of paper and a pen?
Oh my Lord.
No, I'm serious. We will get a connection. Please get your sheets of paper and a pen, and you will be able to comment. It will have to be brief because you're going to write your comments on a sheet of paper. It's the only way we can get a connection right now. And that way we can get your thoughts.
Kane is the expert here.
Best we can do.
I know.
Next time we'll make sure we do a proper test, okay, Kane? We just have to make sure we connect, okay? So, do you have the sheets of paper and the pen? Great. Okay. Good. Otherwise, that's the best we can do.
So, Kane, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Hello, Kane, can you hear me?
It's his laptop.
Yeah, it's like his microphone laptop is not working. So Kane, if you can hear me, can give you me thumbs up. Oh my God. No, I just checked our audio.
Okay, that's my suggestion. Have him in the end. Write down comments if you want, and you can continue. Okay. Sorry, guys, but I mean
Kane, if you're trying to call in, you have to dial the toll-free number, and it will ask you press 1 for English and press 2 for French. So please press 1, and then you have to dial the passcode followed by the number sign. Okay, can you try it again? Because I just tried on my phone, it's working. Just dial Just try to dial the number again. Then press 1 for English, followed by the passcode, which is 766-821-74, and the number sign.
I don't even know how you say it. Someone said that.
Hello?
You got connected. So can you mute your software?
Okay.
Yeah, we can hear you.
You can hear me now?
Kane,
okay.
we can
Hi.
hear you.
Okay. Good.
Okay, great.
Got it. Okay, great. Stuff. Okay.
You go.
Okay.
Well, maybe he
So
wants to say something.
let the ship
Absolutely.
continue.
Yeah,
The
let's
rest,
continue.
we hit the cliff, but now we're back going.
Okay, we're parasailing again.
Yeah, the ship is moving.
Julie was talking about her. So Julie was talking about her experiences with the police.
Right.
Oh.
Well, my grandparents' experience with the police,
Right.
right, and how they felt about policing. And so I think I went through the whole thing where my grandmother told us to play on the train tracks because we could basically avoid the police on either side, on the reserve or the city side. So that speaks to her experience as Indigenous woman with police. Now, she never went into the history of why she believed that they were unsafe, but it's quite clear that was the feeling, and that continues to be the feeling for many Indigenous people and many Indigenous communities. And again, it can be tied back to how children were taken to residential schools. Oftentimes it was the RCMP that was sent into communities, and they would quite literally have their guns out, basically raiding the communities and asking for the kids to be handed over. So would the police be safe to you in that situation? Probably not so much. And so this is where, even when people are affected by crime, there's a hesitancy to reach out to the police because of their past experience or family experience, right? It doesn't necessarily have to happen to you, but if that's the experience of people that you know and love, if it's been profoundly negative, then you're not going to feel very safe in reaching out either. Do you have anything to add to this conversation now that we have you online, Kane?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. It's fabulous.
Okay, have it on speakerphone, so if it's a problem, just let me know. Well, I think part of the problem is that in Canada, it's either over-policing Native people or it's under-policing them. So there are situations where, and that's also linked back to the residential school time and that, because the police were used on a very intimate basis to take children out of the Native communities, along with social workers and other government representatives and stuff. So that from the very beginning, the police were used as a negative force for 10 generations or more. So that was the start of the relationship there. And they're also, because of the education system that we've had in Canada, they're a product of that as well as everyone else today, in terms of the Indigenous the dark period has been the best kept secret. And even at a university level, I used to be the director of Native Education there at the University of Windsor, and professors, quite ignorant or basically not teaching updated information, not teaching about the residential school system or anything. And this was back in 1993 up to 2000. So you can see the vat of lack of information, ignorance, and basically, white privilege, because the fact that we were taken from our proper locations and moved sometimes many, many times into remote areas of the province of Ontario and different parts of the country. And so when you're forcibly removed from your community, just think somebody's coming in and moving all of Oshawa against its will, to a northern part of the province where there's no running water, there's no sewage, there's no electricity, and the only way into your community is, by plane. You could see kind of why that would pose a lot of problems. So the thing is that, the over-policing is that, police just basically been taught to be racist against Native peoples. And very many of them hold attitudes that, Native people are more violent, they're all substance abuse addicted, on and on and on. They've also participated in the foster care system, like taking Native children from their homes and putting them into primarily white foster care systems and stuff. So they over-police because they have this view that Native people are more criminal. They're not, but they're just like anyone else. But the reason why they're more criminal is because of the poverty and all the conditions that set them up to potentially have conflict with law. Just like anyone else that's in jail, primarily, it's for a similar reason: poverty, lack of education, early onset of conflict with the justice system, and lack of education, so on and on and on. So, that's why they're overrepresented, is because basically they're set up from the very beginning with all these obstacles against them. And, a Native man still today in Canada has a better chance of going to prison than he does to university. So we haven't really made much headway, And underrepresentation is the same thing. They're prejudiced. So if a woman calls or family calls during distress and needs help, very often it's like they're really not that important. They're not a priority. There's other calls. We'll take those first. We'll get there. Sometimes after 2 or 3 calls, the police will respond. And sometimes after very unfortunate circumstances have occurred because they just don't care. Because they've been taught not to care. That Native people are a devalued population in Canada.
Absolutely. And I'll share another story. Prior to my working here at Durham College, I worked at Center for Aboriginal Women and Children in Toronto from 1994 to 2008. And from my experience there, I think we've all heard of missing and murdered Indigenous women. This is something that has come to mainstream media probably within the last 5 years. However, when I worked at the shelter, this was something that was on our radar, basically coming out of the Robert Pickton case, where he targeted Indigenous women because he knew and understood that the police did not value Indigenous women and that there would be little to no follow-up. And this is why his criminal activity was able to perpetuate for such a long period of time. Now, during the course of his terror, there were a number of family members and friends of people who had gone missing who went to the police to try to file missing persons reports and were turned away by the police. Basically, the police would say, like, is she street involved? Is she, does she have a drinking problem? She'll be back in a few days. I'm not going to waste my time and take a missing persons report. So based on that information that we had at the shelter, we worked diligently and often an uphill battle with the Toronto Police Department to actually take missing persons reports. So it was something that we had to, again, it was a constant battle working with the police. Again, this is in the mid to late 90s, you know, they were still very hesitant to take those reports, and this is coming from a shelter. And with that being said as well, if we ever did have to contact the police, their response time to the Aboriginal shelter was much longer. I also worked in, or did some extra work at another shelter that was non-Indigenous, and if the police had to be called, they would be there almost immediately. When I was calling from Undayan, it was a much different story. So even on that level, you can see that the police response was completely different, even in the same situation or same scenario. And this is, again, is in, you know, late 90s, early 2000s.
And even one of our elders that we bring in, Gerard, he told us, and this was just 2 years ago, I think, Julie, if you can remind me, he went to the Oshawa Centre, and from the second he entered the Oshawa Centre, he walked around deliberately because he knew what was going on. He was being followed by security the whole entire time he was there because it's assumed that we're criminals, right?
And again, with the over-policing, if you have a police car that is checking to see how many people go through a stop sign, if you have a police car situated there or nearby, you're going to catch more people. It doesn't mean that that's a more violated stop sign. It's just because somebody's watching. Right? So if we had the same level of policing in other neighborhoods or other areas, you would find that the criminal activity would increase because you have somebody watching constantly.
That's right.
Yeah, your thoughts? Yeah.
Well, just, you know, if you, I'm not sure if all of the students, some of them might remember in the news years ago about the Picton farm in BC, Robert Picton, and he had basically was a serial killer and had killed many, many women over a period of time, and almost all of them were Native women, Indigenous women, and they actually went to the police many times, saying that, you know, parents, other people said their daughters were missing, knew that they made a link to the Picton farm and asked them could they please go investigate and check that out, and they were ignored for years. And finally, you know, when they did finally end up having a link there for some reason, came to light. But again, that was another example of how Indigenous women are not seen as valued. You know, they're not seen as other women in the Canadian context. They're expendable. They're disposable. Indigenous people are basically taken for granted that, you know, our needs are basically, you know, should be met last, so to speak. And so the police, you know, they continue to try to learn, and obviously they need to. And but, you know, it's going to take a long, long time, because when you have 100 years of a negative relationship plus, you know, it's obviously the trust is not there. And, you know, but they are trying to make some steps forward in that regard. They do have some positive interactions with some Native communities and youth and things like that, but there's a long, long way to go.
But that goes to show that whole the overrepresentation of Indigenous women in the entire justice system, and then those numbers are even more pronounced compared to the non-Indigenous population in Canada. And then we also talk about youth in the same justice system, right? Those numbers are skyrocketing, you know, 30, 40, 50%, and you compare it to the other numbers which are actually falling. So how do you explain that sort of correlation?
Well, it really comes down to just there's a real view that, you know, Native people are, you know, like create more crime. They, you know, they're more violent, you know, and therefore they're just not as important. I mean, you know, it's like we are involved in crime. We do these crimes. We do murders. We do everything that any other population does. But the thing is that, you know, until the economic context, the political context, and everything changes, you know, it's basically we're still going to continue to be well over 25, 27%, you know, whether it's youth or whether it's adults, and the females, it's really skyrocketing because, and same thing, they were always overrepresented in Kingston Penitentiary for years until they closed that down and had women kind of relocated closer to home communities kind of across Canada. Not so perfect, but definitely a lot better, because as a woman, as an Indigenous woman from anywhere in Canada, you know, you would be brought to Kingston and you would be there for that entire time with absolutely no visitation, you know, because nobody would have access. Can you still hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Oh, okay. Sorry. It just looked like it was being cut off or something. Anyway, so it was just like lack of you know, just lack of response to how to deal with the Aboriginal community and the Indigenous community now, like in terms of how do we, as the Canadian justice system, work with Indigenous people in a way that shows value, understands the context that they are a collective society, that we have different values and different way of doing things than just mainstream Canada, and they can't keep continuing to want to put us in this little box. And, you know, you can't deal with a collective society that values holistic, you know, lifestyle, decision-making, the importance of the group, the, you know, patience, humility, not confronting things head-on, being concerned about not harming one or the collective of the group and things like that. So it's like there's a lot of values and different ways of seeing the world that we have to connect with, because you can't put those two together. They're very different. You know, a mainstream society and a collective society. And you have to, you know, go to the Native people to find out what is the best way to deal with a collective society. What are your values? How can we work with those values in a more harmonious way to make better decisions around different forms of justice? Locking people up in a box, doesn't matter if they're not Native, it's not justice. It does not help. It serves no purpose whatsoever.
Other than to create more criminal activity.
And jobs for non-Indigenous people.
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't, you know, and Canada depends on the justice system. I mean, you know, we are a very heavy-handed nation. You know, even with our lack of crime to a large extent, it's like, you know, we depend on the justice system. And so it's like there could be lots of alternatives. Many people in the federal penitentiary systems are there because of addiction. You know, we're talking about Native people, but a lot of people are. They're there for addictions. They're there for ongoing, you know, mental health problems. It's the highest population. The federal penitentiary system has the highest population of mental health conditions than any other institution in Canada in one place. So it's not even meant for mental health, but they have the highest rate of mental health people because they get in conflict with the law because of their unsolved mental health problems, and they end up getting in trouble with the law and they end up going to prison. People go, Aboriginal people, if they have an addiction, instead of dealing with the addiction as a society, they end up getting so desperate, like other people, and they go and, you know, pretend they have a gun and go and tell the teller I have a gun and I need money. They get money, they get caught, and that money is to feed an addiction. Not, and obviously they had no gun, but they still get the same charge as armed robbery because they said they had a gun. And, you know, obviously the teller is, you know, equally terrified whether they think the person has a gun or not. So, you know, but the thing is, people are, you know, we should have systems in place where the mental health is addressed. Give them a sentence, but give them a mental health sentence, an appropriate one. Send them to a particular facility that only deals with mental health problems, or a facility that only deals with addiction issues. If you dealt with these really root causes of why people are in so much pain that end up becoming in conflict with the law over and over. You know, send them to a place for 3 years to deal with their mental health, 3 years to deal with their addictions, but chances are they're probably not going to be a repeat offender. You know,
Okay, so
and
let's-
help them integrate back into the community for jobs and other things and stuff. But you know, putting them all in the same box together, whether they're murderers or they're there because of addictions or other things, is not helpful.
So let's talk about the root causes, and you know, maybe we can draw a line back to, you know, where this comes from. You know, the reality is that Indigenous people are not innately more criminal than anybody else. However, due to systemic discrimination within the justice system, we're overrepresented. And again, things like mental health issues, addictions, you know, these are not something, these are something that has been created due to the process of colonization and the residential school system. So we can tie all these, you know, issues that are prevalent today to Canada's policy on Indigenous people. And when we look at it that way, we can tie back to what's happened, but what are the solutions?
Yeah.
One of the elders that we bring in, Gerard Sagasage, has often worked within the criminal justice system, and the experience that he has shared is that what he finds to be the most beneficial for people who are incarcerated is if they receive their name. So I think this goes back to looking at the two different worldviews and how Indigenous people see the world, and the connection between what our traditional values are, how that's been cut by Canadian policy towards Indigenous people, the residential schools, the 60 Scoop. So that anchor to our culture and tradition, that is what kept our communities strong historically. So knowing our clans, knowing our obligations under our clan system, and how we are to act in community is what kept us healthy and safe. And those are the things that have been affected by Canadian policy. And so that's what needs to be repaired. And so, you know, we have to acknowledge that we have two completely different worldviews. And when we talk about the criminal justice system, and when Indigenous people talk about restorative justice practices, they're two completely different methods. I would definitely vote on the side of restorative justice, which is very different than the criminal justice system. You know, it does a community no good to lock somebody away for 3 years, you know, especially, you know, let's say they have 4 kids. Who's now going to support those children? What is going to happen to them? Are they now going to be placed in care? So we can see that this all becomes a huge ripple effect when, you know, what we did in our communities 150 years ago was very beneficial. There were not these high rates of crime. There was no property crimes. Nothing like that occurred. It's only since this inception of this Western idea of criminal behavior
Punitive.
that has been that it's become problematic. And so when Indigenous people are able to culturally connect again, you know, again, this is Gerard's finding, that they don't return back into the justice system once they have their anchor. How do you feel about that statement, Kane? Or has that been your experience in working within the justice system?
Well, I mean, in every culture, with regards to, you know, like once they get into the federal law, the federal prison system, there's always that are, I guess you would say, career criminals that continue to, you know, that come out and they stay life for a while and they go back and they get in trouble again. So I mean, that's just as much there with Native people as well, whether that's compounded by over-policing or the fact that, you know, when federal prisoners come back into communities, especially if they're urban centers, very often, you know, they're not coming like home. They're coming to a halfway house very often with absolutely no support in their life whatsoever, no family at all usually. And they know very little bit about their culture because they've been introduced to it for the first time as a prisoner by some of the elders in there and stuff. And, and they do get a lot of self-esteem and, it does give them a sense of purpose. But what happens very often is because there's no follow-up programs in the community other than like a halfway house or whatever. And most of them are seen by correctional services as just a holding cell, basically. They don't want you to do any counseling. They don't want you to do any therapy. They do some programs in the community and stuff that are very, mainstream based. So very quickly, a lot of times, I find that the Aboriginal men, once they're in the community for a while, they kind of start losing that momentum that they had when they were in prison with the elders and stuff. So unless they can connect to a Native community once they come out and elders and have an ongoing support system and purpose, they're really kind of set up for failure. It's just a matter of time.
So then we need to offer more supports within the system to ensure that Indigenous people continue to feel connected within their community?
Yeah, that's right. Because the thing is that, a lot of people are from Canada is a big place. So, depending on where you end up, you could basically not have, and also because there's so much pressures on the halfway houses, very often you could potentially be in another province. You could come out and you might have to go to another province, or you might have to go to Northern Ontario, but your community's in Southern Ontario, or vice versa. So even that is not ideal. But yeah, I think, and corrections mandate stops at the time that the warrant expires. So they're not really their mandate isn't into real community integration. It's into incarceration. And that's a problem, because there needs to be a second arm for that follow-up, for that reintegration into the community. And it would really, they'd need to be there very consistently for a good year or more in order for that person to stabilize themselves. And that's just not there. It's missing.
How can we realistically make that happen, though? Because I agree with you. I think there needs to be that second arm of corrections to sort of have these sort of supports in place. But, I just look at sort of the government, and how can we even realistically...
Well, if the government made that commitment, how much does it cost to keep somebody incarcerated, as opposed to how much would it cost to provide community supports? Right?
Yeah.
Where is the greater saving? In prevention? Right?
Well, obviously, prevention is always the best, and that's where the worst at that. On everything. It doesn't matter whether it's youth or not. It very often, another bias, what happens at the youth level is because when they get in trouble with, as a young offender, very often the first response is to put them in secure custody, youth facility, while they're waiting to go before the judge. And it's been proven through research that if you're put into secure custody as a holding period before you see the judge, instead of going to an open custody facility while you're waiting, you're more likely to get, if you get your sentence, you're more likely to go right back to the secure custody facility, because that's where you were waiting. So something as simple as changing the holding location when somebody gets in trouble, especially even first-time offenders, the Aboriginal youth and stuff, if they're held in an open custody setting, chances are they're going to get an open custody sentence, which is a lot less intrusive than a secure custody facility where you're dealing with gangs and very serious offenses and things.
The other conversation that you made up a really good point about privilege. Can you expand on that a bit? Because I feel like that word is being tossed around a lot lately. So, Kane and Julie?
Julie, you can go first.
Okay. Well, although I am Indigenous, I have to acknowledge the privilege that I have by not appearing to be Indigenous. So a lot of people don't necessarily associate my experience based on the color of my skin because they assume that I'm not Indigenous. It doesn't mean that that's not my history and that those traumas have not been my traumas. However, I understand that, when I'm driving down the street, there isn't a cop following me based on the color of my skin, or I'm not followed at Shoppers Drug Mart based on the color of my skin. So, privilege is about what is immediately seen and lots of assumptions. And I completely acknowledge all the privilege that I've had based on how I appear.
Okay, so what I'll add to that is that white privilege is, it's about the fact that you're the colonizer to begin with. And you basically, at that point in time, expect the group that you've colonized to follow the expectations of what you feel is the norm, what makes you comfortable. So that's why, children were taken from their communities because they wanted to, make these children civilized. That's why they wanted to put them in residential schools, separate their brothers and sisters from each other, cut off all their hair, beat them if they spoke their language. Many of them were sexually abused, physically abused. Many were murdered, never to return home again. And this went on for 10 generations. So when those 15-year-olds or whatever to say then go home, basically they no longer speak their language. They don't know anything about their culture anymore. They're going back to a community that basically all of the adults left behind lost their purpose of why they were there. Because in the collectivist community, everyone has a purpose. Somebody's the storyteller, somebody's, the medicine person. You got your elders that are teaching your oral stories. Like everybody, your aunties teaching you, if you're a girl, about your moon cycle, your menstrual cycle. There's all sorts of roles that are there. Teaching them about hunting, and all of the different things, what makes an Indigenous male, and an Indigenous female, what are her values as being, what are her roles and values as being an Indigenous female. So when all those things are broken down and those kids go back and the only experience with sexuality they've ever had is rape, they get together as a couple, what kind of parents are they going to be? How do they even understand who they are? And their children get taken away. And this goes on for 100 generations. For 10 generations. So that's the start of the white privilege, is basically trying to turn an entire population to act like them. And then white privilege is having all these people in power and making the decisions on behalf of the Indigenous people. And being comfortable because they don't have to be uncomfortable. They don't want to get to know the other. So they don't have to experience any discomfort because the rules of engagement are going to be done the way they want them to be done. So what needs to change is that they need to understand that they have white privilege. They've had the power, and now they need to go to the Indigenous people, not us to them. They need to go to the Indigenous people and say, what do we need to do to make this relationship work? What do you need from us to stop all the harm from the residential school, the education policy, the Indian Act, which is one of the most racist documents that ever existed, that South Africa borrowed Canada's Indian Act to institute apartheid in 1964. So how to break down the people there. So, we have some incredibly dark history periods. So these are the things that, whether it's a church whether it's some sort of club or school or whatever it is, every community, these people need to come to the Indigenous people and say, we would like to be a part of your life. We'd like to involve you in decision making. We'd love you to be a part of this community. What do we need to do to make that happen?
So then you're talking about reconciliation, or this is a part of reconciliation.
Part of reconciliation, yeah.
And so, when we look at reconciliation, because there's a lot of non-Indigenous people that are looking to Indigenous people to solve the problem. And from my perspective, this is not reconciliation is not our issue to solve. That's the rest of Canada. We absolutely need allies. Our communities have been broken, destroyed. There's a lot of repair that needs to happen within First Nations communities due to the process of colonization, residential schools, the 60s scoop. That's the work that we need to do. And Indigenous community in a way that is meaningful to us and that is not necessarily the Western way. And so this is where we continue to feel this sort of clash in how we do things. And that's the part of reconciliation that needs to be addressed, is acknowledging that we are different, and that different doesn't mean one is better and one is less than. It just means that we're different. And so the difference can be celebrated in knowing that we will be able to care for our communities when we are provided the sort of the ability to do that without having everything federally imposed. So communities that have a say over their own form of self-governance, their own education system, the communities that are culturally connected, those are very strong communities, as opposed to those where everything continues to be federally governed, say like Attawapiskat, where, again, if we talk about the mental health situation, yes, there are a tremendous amount of Indigenous people with mental health issues. Is it any wonder the trauma and historic past that we've had to endure? Indigenous people are coping with such a huge amount of trauma that, oftentimes it's, not seen as productive ways to deal with the trauma. However, it's a coping mechanism. And so communities that are culturally connected are far more...
They're thriving.
They're thriving.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so if we acknowledge that across all areas, not just in First Nations communities, but to address mental health issues and understanding that, maybe for Indigenous people, mental health isn't the same as, like, mental health from an Indigenous perspective is not the same as mental health from a Western perspective, and, acknowledging that traditional ceremonies, that language and smudging are equally valid as Western methodologies, and that Indigenous methodologies may be the key to success for Indigenous service users.
So how do we get...
How do we get there?
Yeah, how do we get there? So as a non-Indigenous person who... believes in this whole reconciliation term that's being thrown out there by everybody in mainstream media, how do we get there, though? And what is our responsibility? Like students here, first-year PSI students, what is our collective responsibility? Or is there a collective responsibility?
Well, absolutely, I think so. So what I would say is that, yes, it is everybody's responsibility. And first, we have to understand the history. So that portion has to be taught and taught properly within the school system. So at this point, they're starting maybe now in
grade 3, I think.
Yeah,
grade 4.
Primary school to learn this. This is not something that was taught 25 years ago, and so this again is going to take time. So reconciliation is not a one action thing that everything's all of a sudden magically going to be okay. This is a process and a walk that we take together. We didn't end up in this situation in one generation. Again, as Indigenous people, we think in terms of 7 generations. So what the impacts of residential schools has been, that's going to affect the next 7 generations. And this isn't something that happened, 200 years ago. The last residential school closed in 1996. And although we don't have residential schools today, it's still problematic because many students have to be educated away from their homes. Commuting, they're still having to leave their communities in order to get their high school, which is problematic again. So the work that we need to do, everyone needs to know exactly the history of Canada. Everyone has to stop thinking that Christopher Columbus found and discovered America. That would be like, number one. He never even stood foot in America, ever.
But yet yesterday was Columbus Day.
But,
yeah.
So funny how that is.
Yeah.
So all the history, it needs to be rethought, retaught, and the true history can be taught. And when people understand what's actually happened, I think there's a greater ability for people who want to move. And what I say is, we're all political beings. Okay? Every single person in this room has a political voice. And our leaders are supposed to uphold our wishes. So write a letter. Write many letters. Always write letters. They have a legal obligation, or I don't know if it's a legal obligation, but they do respond to you. Whenever you write a letter to a politician, to the Prime Minister, to any of the ministers, they will respond. You will get a written response. If every single Canadian wrote a letter to the Minister of Justice and told them how they felt about the overrepresentation, right, and then that needs to be addressed as a Canadian huge issue, then there might be a little bit more push to actually get something done if every single Canadian said that it was important for them to change that. Because our political leaders are there to support what it is that we want them to do. It's not always what happens, right? But if we're apathetic about the process and don't do anything, you're still perpetuating the same ideals. So each of you has a political voice. Each of you can make a difference in the political arena and in your own personal lives. You all have friends. You all have family. We can have discussions about what is actually happening on the ground today within Indigenous communities. And this is how alliances are made and how things change over time, is to have those honest conversations. It's not comfortable. Right? And nobody wants to get stuck in the past. However, we have to understand how we got to where we are today in order to move things forward. If we never actually learn the history, then there will be this continued blame of Indigenous people for their plight in the world today, and that will just continue, right? Indigenous people are there because
that's the part that
lazy.
we hear all the time.
Yes.
Is how can we help these communities? They're in such a remote part of Ontario, for example, that they're a flying community. But is it realistic for a government to help a community of 250 people?
Absolutely. Who doesn't count?
Yeah.
Who are the people that do not count? And there shouldn't be anybody.
Well, and keep in mind that even in urban centers like Oshawa, you have usually, anywhere like between here and Toronto, you have 5,000 people or so, Métis and different forms of Aboriginal people living right in the urban center. So get to know them. And so when I said about come to us, I don't mean come to us to get us to do the work for you. I mean, come to us, get to know us, in order to really get to know another culture, you have to allow yourself to feel uncomfortable, to get out of that white privilege. You have to go to events, you have to go to powwows, you have to go to the cultural centers, you have to talk to the people, you have to ask questions, you have to, and if you have a Native person in your class or in your workplace, whatever, you don't ask them. You ask them, what do I need to do to, develop it? And they say, well, you have to go to this community, offer tobacco, whatever. But we shouldn't do the work. You have to involve yourself and allow yourself to be uncomfortable to go through these teachings, so you really understand what your role is in walking with for a change.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You're not going to fix the problem. Together, we're going to affect this change. And that's really how it has to be. So absolutely, there's resources at the Aboriginal Student Center for students to look at research. Our local First Nations community is 25 minutes north of here. The Durham region has a high Aboriginal population. It's over 12,000, and that's from the last census in the Durham region. So we have a high Indigenous population, and we're the fastest growing population with the highest numbers under 25. So there's more and more and more and more of us. So unless we address the issues that are presenting today, it's just going to become more problematic. So again, my undergraduate work around crime and deviance showed a high representation. That has only grown over the last 25 years. That number hasn't shrunk.
Unless we start doing something.
Yes.
And it was recommended 25 years ago, but nothing has...
it was recommended in the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. That document was extremely thorough. Unfortunately, it was shelved almost immediately. And today we have the calls to action through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which can act as a framework on the work that we need to do within different sections of society, and as well as what we can do individually. So individually, we all have the opportunity to educate ourselves and learn what has happened and what is happening currently and what we can do to make a difference. And if you guys are all going into policing fields, then you guys play a vital role in how Indigenous people are going to be treated within the justice system. And when we think, it's not just your one action. That also has an effect. So if you treat an Indigenous person fairly and judiciously, then other people are going to see that. And again, we think in terms of 7 generations. So in understanding this is not a problem that's going to go away in one generation. But unless we start to make those actions, and when we begin to make them, that change will begin to grow. But we have to make a commitment to ourselves and to our communities that this is something that we see as beneficial. And again, if I recall the numbers, that we're the fastest growing population under 25, it is absolutely essential that we start to address these issues, because that's a lot of population. Now I can tell you one thing, Indigenous people are awesome, and we're really good at making babies. So there's a lot of them.
It's a great way to...
But it's true. Like, I grew up in the Durham region. I went to school in Oshawa, and at that time I was told that once there were Indians that lived here, but that was a long time ago, and now they're all gone. I did raise my hand and say, well, that's absolutely not true. I have a massive family. Okay, when we have a family reunion, we get swag, we get sweatshirts, hats, keychains, the whole bit. I'm like totally serious. A family chart, and I thought, oh my God, what the heck am I going to do? My chart was about 3 trees put together, all in all. And it was at that time that I learned that other people had, 3 or 4 cousins, where I had like over 150.
Yeah, I have like
first
32 first cousins, and I thought that was a
Yeah.
lot.
Yeah, like first cousins and second cousins
Yeah.
and third cousins. There's lots of us, right? So there's a lot of Indigenous people, and we need to address these. We need to begin to look at what the issues are,
Yeah.
and not just sweep it under the table and pretend like it's something that's going to go away on its own. So there has to be real change that happens.
And I think that's what it is. I think people are just hoping, okay, great, we've done this, now it's here. Okay, it's going to go away now.
No.
Somehow it's going to magically fix itself, and we're not going to have anyone, independently looking at. It's done, but yet I'm hoping it exists, it's still there, it stays in the media, you guys are still exposed to it continuously, whatever areas of law enforcement you want to go into, because it's a paramount issue. I mean, the Supreme Court say it's one of the crises in the entire justice system. That's a huge undertaking by the Supreme Court to say that. Kane, anything to add before we sort of close?
It's just that when we were talking about what people's responsibilities are, it's like, they were given a little piece of the puzzle today. So, take that puzzle little piece and keep building on it, because, you have to educate yourself at the starting point, and you have to allow yourself, like I said, in order to get to know somebody else that's different than you, you have to really allow yourself to feel uncomfortable and go to places where you're not comfortable. And get to know those people, and once you go through that little initiation period, then you will become an alliance with that community.
Absolutely.
So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Kate.
Okay, thank you.
That was a good place.
Pardon me?
I thought that was a good